Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Marissa Adams, and I'm the marketing manager here at Trace. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end during Q&A. We will be sending out the slides and recordings to all of the attendees next week, whether or not they attended today. To get us started, I wanted to introduce Trace Security and give you some background on our expertise in information security. Trace Security LLC is a leading provider of cybersecurity and compliance solutions, and we celebrated 18 years in business this year. We were founded on February 18th, 2004, as one of the first technology companies to incubate in the Louisiana Technology Park. Our company's mission at its founding was simple: to help banks and credit unions protect their customer and member information and comply with GLBA, FFIEC, and NCUA requirements. Since then, Trace Security has served over 3,000 organizations across the United States and US territories. We have established many partnerships, most notably our strategic alliance with CUNA, the Credit Union National Association, which positions us as their exclusive provider of cybersecurity and compliance services. This partnership also includes an endorsement from over 20 credit union leagues in the US. Trace Security offers a comprehensive portfolio of solutions that allow organizations to manage their information security program, including IT risk assessments, audits, social engineering, penetration testing, security training, and more. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to my colleagues, Garrett Campbell and Gavin Debetaz, who will be discussing the ins and outs of penetration testing.
Hi, my name is Gavin Debetaz. I'm one of the information security analysts responsible for conducting services like penetration tests, IT audits, and risk assessments. I've worked part-time for Trace Security for over 2 years, and I just recently joined the team full-time after graduating with my bachelor's degree in computer science. I've conducted many penetration tests for Trace Security, and I'm excited to share my knowledge about the service with all of you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Garrett Campbell. I'm also one of Trace Security's information security analysts. I've been focusing on internal penetration tests, social engineering, and IT security audits for about 4 years now. During my time with Trace Security, I've come across an array of various size organizations that have used our penetration testing services for compliance and incident response purposes. Today, I hope to share some of these exciting experiences with you all and hopes to show all of our attendees that there's no wrong time to start a penetration test with us. So today, we'll be discussing what a penetration test is and the different types you may need. We'll cover the varied approaches to penetration test and what is necessary to meet compliance requirements as well. Finally, we'll talk about common vulnerabilities we find during testing, new vulnerabilities being exploited today, and the efforts you can take to mitigate them.
Something that I've heard a few times during audits is that when you ask clients if they conduct penetration tests, they'll respond with, well, we do vulnerability assessments regularly. While vulnerability assessments are a great resource to help identify risk and vulnerabilities in your systems, they do not actually test any of these vulnerabilities. Penetration tests aim to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in your systems in a simulated cyber attack, and they provide a useful perspective on the attack vectors that a real-world hacker might use to exploit your systems. Penetration tests also cover a wider range of systems, such as mobile applications and networks. Network penetration testing is the most common penetration test that we offer. The more access your customers and employees have to your networks and systems, the more potential entry points there are for a malicious attacker. We offer 4 types of network penetration tests: external, internal, wireless, and purple team tests. The external penetration test focuses on testing external connections on your network, such as web pages, firewalls, and mail and file transfer servers. Part of this assessment includes attempting to brute force into web pages and spoofing emails from email servers. Attackers are more likely to have access to your externally facing connections rather than your internal connections, so it's important to make sure there are no glaring issues.
On the other hand, the internal penetration test focuses on testing your internal connections, such as internal databases, hosted web applications, dedicated application servers that might not touch the web, you name it. We look for vulnerable TCP/IP services available to us, captive portals, and other various services that we can find on the internal side of our client's network. Internal connections will most likely host highly sensitive information, such as personally identifiable information and bank account information. So it's important to make sure an attacker does not have access to these resources. A wireless network penetration test focuses on the security configurations of your wireless networks, wireless access policies, and topology mapping of the wireless signal string throughout the branches of your organization. Whether or not your organization allows public access to your wireless network, it still represents a potential leverage point for malicious attackers. Mitigating wireless signal range and ensuring that rogue device detection alerts are generated and delivered are some of the key findings to improve wireless network management that we assist in identifying during these services. And then finally, we have the Purple Team test. The Purple Team test involves a coordinated effort between our Red Team attackers and your Blue Team IT staff to verify your internal detection services as we perform internal penetration testing. What we normally do with this test is create a timestamp of spreadsheet information for different levels of privilege access. Usually we start out with none, so this could be functions with network discovery and ping sweeping, just to give some examples. Next, we have user access capabilities. This is low-level system access with a baseline security group. Our clients can set this type of account up that we can RDP into remotely, or we can do this on a configured workstation while on site. This could be any kind of baseline security group template that you have in place. And then if we're lucky enough to actually gain this during the test, we'll map out what we can do with privileged access or administrative access. And we try to show how far we can go with an analyst-created admin account.
Next, we have application security testing, which is a more in-depth form of penetration testing of your applications, rather than a sweeping test of all the applications on your network. There are 3 types of application security tests that we perform: web application testing, mobile application testing, and API testing. Application security testing is an important part of the development and maintenance of your organization's web and mobile applications. Users love the convenience of online and mobile banking applications, but they also present unique security holes that need to be addressed. Trace Security's App Security Testing Services are the Open Web Application Security Project Foundation, or OWASP, which prescribes security standards for web applications, mobile applications, and APIs. It's considered best practice to perform application security testing at least annually and when any major updates are made to configurations. PCI DSS, or Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard Testing, is required for organizations that process, store, or transmit electronic card transactions. This type of testing focuses on the data flow of electronic card transaction data through your organization's networks and systems. PCI DSS penetration tests likely need to be performed on your external and internal networks based on the flow of electronic card information through your organization.
Black box, white box, and gray box testing do not refer to what is being tested, but instead it focuses on how the testing occurs and what prior knowledge of the system is allowed to the analyst. Each of these tests represents the levels of network access and knowledge of the working environment that an analyst is granted to conduct the test. Black box testing grants the analyst the least amount of network access to perform the test. The analyst will have to use tools and tricks to gain access to IP addresses using publicly available information such as domain information. This test provides the most accurate emulation of what a real-world attack would look like, but the results might not be as comprehensive as a traditional test. This is because the analyst could be blocked from accessing the network, or they could not find enough information online to conduct a thorough test. Next, we have white box testing. White box testing is the traditional penetration testing method. In white box testing, the analyst is whitelisted, so they have full access to the organization's systems. This testing method also includes fuzzing, if anybody has heard that term, which is an attempt to input various presumed username and password combinations on a known system. In addition, the analyst is given the list of IP addresses that are to be tested, rather than having to conduct their own research to discover them. White box testing will provide the most accurate and in-depth results of the vulnerabilities of an organization's system, but it is unlikely that a real-world attacker will be able to easily achieve the information that the analyst uses to exploit these vulnerabilities. Gray box testing is the happy medium between the black and white box test. In these tests, the analyst is given some access to the organization's network. The amount of access is typically determined through scoping and could be things like internal access to the network or access to current system logs. These tests are designed to test the security inside the organization's external defenses, like their firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and intrusion prevention systems. These are great tests to help with configurations of new alerts for firewalls, SIEM solutions, or other centralized logging solutions you have in place.
Whether performed in-house, by a managed security service provider, or by a third party, there are various tests that can fall under the penetration testing umbrella. Depending on the size and complexity of your IT environment, you may require more or less intense testing. These days, financial institutions have a plethora of penetration testing companies to choose from, which is great for varied pricing, scope, and intensity. The problem, however, lies in whether the testing meets the third-party compliance requirements. A true third-party penetration test should involve vulnerability scans, false positive validation, and especially manual testing of found vulnerabilities. Identifying vulnerabilities is simply not enough. With manual testing, your organization will have a full view of how exploitable your vulnerabilities are, what a malicious attacker could access, and what vulnerabilities require your immediate attention. We've had many clients come to us under the assumption that their penetration tests are being taken care of, when in reality, they're only performing vulnerability scans with no manual testing. When it comes to contracting these services, it's important to know exactly what you're paying for.
Now, I know what some of you are thinking. If I use a third party to manage my information technology, I can also get them to perform my annual third-party penetration testing. This is where things can get a little dicey. The third-party requirement doesn't just mean a third party to you, but a third party to the IT management. You wouldn't want your IT management company to test themselves for security the same way that you wouldn't let an employee do their own performance review. It's always a solid practice to bring in a dedicated security firm to check the existing configurations of a managed service provider. This process is not meant to be a contest, but rather an independent review of current configurations to further the strength of configurations present on the network. Our job is to promote awareness of potential pitfalls to any clients we have an active contract with. This process is meant to be cohesive with MSSPs and benefit the working environment to which we are both custodians to. All standard trace security penetration tests involve a vulnerability scan, manual removal of false positives, and manual exploitation of found vulnerabilities. This includes a vulnerability scan, a network discovery scan with Nmap, manual checks of common vulnerabilities, and then manual exploitation attempts of found vulnerabilities. If we can find a vulnerability and push an exploit through, then it is considered a verified vulnerability for the sake of our testing. Verified vulnerabilities are organized based on severity and reported to the client with actionable recommendations for remediation. Now we're going to discuss a few common vulnerabilities and findings that we see during our penetration testing services. And we'll also share a couple of stories from the field of successful penetration tests and how the client used the results to strengthen their IT environment.
There's been a new high-risk vulnerability that's been detected in many external networks. This vulnerability targets systems with the Diffie-Hellman key exchange ciphers to create a denial of service. An attacker can specially craft packets to send to a host using Diffie-Hellman ciphers, which will trigger expensive server-side calculations. These server-side calculations can cause systems to overheat and shut down. Our current recommendation for this vulnerability is to remove DHC ciphers in favor of elliptical curve DHC ciphers or RSA key exchange. New vulnerabilities such as these are being discovered all the time, and this stresses the importance of performing periodic testing. A finding that I've noticed is more common than most would think is the use of HTTP for login pages rather than HTTPS. This seems to be more common in smaller organizations with less information security infrastructure. Most times when there's an open HTTP port, an analyst would just assume that it's going to redirect them to an HTTPS website. But a surprising amount of organizations still use HTTP for their websites, even despite all the information that's been spread about their risk. This vulnerability is more common for internal systems such as camera systems or internal training systems, but I've seen this a handful of times for websites that house sensitive information. This can be a devastating vulnerability because HTTP does not use any encryption during transmission. This can result in sensitive information such as account information being easily stolen by a packet sniffer such as Wireshark or TCP dump. Some people might believe this would be difficult to achieve, but a penetration test will show that a skilled attacker can capture these login credentials quickly and easily. This attack can be devastating for our organization's members and public image. In my experience, it's very rare to find an open DNS port when performing an external penetration test, but I've discovered a few over the years. Most organizations do not have a need for this port to be open on their external networks. But this organization that I was testing not only had their DNS port open, but they also had it misconfigured. For anyone unfamiliar with how DNS works, whenever an employee tries to go to a website such as facebook.com, a DNS server will take that request and return the proper IP address to them so that the employee can access that website. These searches are saved in a temporary storage cache that the employee does not have to make the same full request every time they want to access Facebook, which saves time and resources. Unfortunately for this organization, that cache can be accessed if your DNS server is not configured properly. During this test, I was able to snoop and access that cache using a script. And all I'll say is you would be quite surprised at what some people look up at during work. This vulnerability can not only be embarrassing, but it can also be dangerous because sensitive information such as vendor and service provider information could be leaked. Also, a skilled attacker will know what websites your employees frequent and can use that information for social engineering or to set up a watering hole attack. A watering hole attack is when an attacker observes websites that an organization often uses and infects one or more of them with malware. Obviously, the easiest remediation for this vulnerability is to not allow public access to your DNS server. However, the reason this attack was successful is that this organization had recursion enabled on their DNS server. So if you must have your DNS port open to public access, it's beneficial to disable recursion that this does not happen to your organization. Also, maybe give your employees a reminder of your acceptable use policies.
The most low-hanging and leverageable finding that we come across during internal testing is default passwords on various TCP IP services, such as SSH, FTP, and occasionally Telnet. With just FTP access, I've found HIPAA violations such as death certificates caught on printers for proof of transfer of assets. And the one thing that nobody really talks about with this type of high-dollar finding is that it doesn't feel good when you find something like this. Things get far too personal, far too quickly. When it comes to SSH, there are certain devices, when initialized, that still contain a default password, such as root admin, admin, or root. This can be present on digital video recorders tied to your camera system as well. The last time this was found was also when I was performing an on-site social engineering test. After I performed the OSC, I plugged into a working dock at a workstation and had reboot actions available to me for every digital video recorder in this client's network. If I were a bad actor, I had the ability to wipe any evidence of my visit or description of myself, thus eliminating key forensic data of my actions. This type of data is a critical find for our clients and helps ensure that client organizations do not learn of misconfigurations or default passwords the hard way. While it's rare to find Telnet in use on a critical system these days, we're still finding this occasionally on certain vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. This TCP/IP function can credential capture when left open on the internal network and make eavesdropping on a user account and password much simpler than it should be. Even though these are a few of the TCP/IP services for our common vulnerability checks as part of our vulnerability assessments and penetration test, the evidence gathered on these misconfigured or default services can create quite the headache for some of our clients. In both of these cases, the results are always helpful for our clients who would be considered evolving organizations. These are organizations who have exceeded most normal best practices and are making configurations to better prevent advanced persistent threat attackers. In my most recent on-site, I worked with our main point of contact to help record some custom alerts in the firewall and SIEM solution that they had in place from the very beginning of our assessment. Whenever we start one of these services, we have to call in various GitHub tools, Python initiation packages, and Python tool dependencies. Our clients can create custom firewall or SIEM system alerts for this type of activity, specifically the SSH drops and outbound calls to GitHub and python.org. These are huge indicators for a potential bad actor who, in some cases, would be using a zero-day vulnerability that is present into the network. This has been more popular this year in that no time is wasted in troubleshooting scanner issues before technical testing. After these alerts are configured, our clients will have a solid chance of detecting more suspicious activity before a foothold is achieved. Also, the only thing that the Security Information and Event Management System, or SIEM system, was able to detect, which was managed by a vendor, was an update request for my Kali Linux virtual machine. This was just a simple apt-get update. And this is not something we usually perform when setting up these tools. Now that the client has these custom alerts in place, their incident response internal procedures are much more comprehensive for detecting suspicious activity on any host who has successfully initiated a live connection into the internal network.
The last best scenario that I've seen a client utilize an IPT for is testing how their current internal personnel reacts to alerts generated by an active internal penetration test. I've yet to meet an organization that did not learn something in keeping a few information security analysts in the dark during internal penetration testing. The results are always subjective from client to client. There are always small things detected, and there are always some activity items that go unseen by current configurations. Whether your incident response team or MSP has performed this type of tabletop walkthrough, there's nothing better to improve current response procedures than have a more active dress rehearsal during one of our penetration tests.
So that's everything that we prepared for you all today. We hope you learned some new information about penetration testing and how important they are to your IT management efforts. Marissa has been gathering some questions from you in the chat, so we'll go ahead and start answering those. But feel free to drop more questions if you have them, and you can reach out to Gavin or myself at any time with additional questions.
All right, so I have a question for you guys here. To have a third-party managed system tested, do we need to have a clause in their contract that allows for audits?
100%. I think it's always great to include this. You do see this on some of the upper tier FFIEC audits, and it's always a good practice, even for smaller organizations. It's not a bad idea to have a clause in that contract to ensure that you get a representative from that company to actually be a part of that process. Because if you do have something fail over, that's who you're going to call anyway, and it's better to have them involved in that. Plus, like I talked about, this is a cohesive effort when we do this with these providers. It's not a contest. We also learn a lot of things from them on their side that we can also better for other clients who might have that same vendor and might be smaller and not have that much labor that they can allocate to the issue. But yeah, absolutely, always a great call.
And somebody asked what you were setting up in Kali Linux on that field story you were telling.
That's a very subjective question. We'll have to need a little more detail on that right there. I think this is for like when I was setting, what was I setting up in Kali Linux? So whenever you install the scanner, if this is your first time doing an internal penetration test, we usually call in a couple different penetration testing tools depending on what we see for network capability after those network discovery and Nmap scans. This can be, I mean, it changes. It's mainly, we have to call in certain versions of Python 3 and certain dependencies for that. Now, just blocking like python.org, I'm actually dealing with an issue with this right now, because right now I can't call my tools in for a white box test because it hasn't been whitelisted properly. They're either blocking all HTTPS outbound access on that scanner, which is a great practice to do when the scanner is not in use, but when it's time to go live, we do need a little bit more access to call those tools into the network, and then we can check to see. But no, absolutely. It's mainly just any kind of GitHub-based tool, any kind of Python-based tool, which is also, I mean, it kind of falls into the same category. But if somebody was going to do it manually and not use, just a git clone there to get that tool in, they're still going to have to call in Python dependencies manually. And so that's why it's important to grab both of them.
All right, and we got, what if my ISP or MSP has a policy not to whitelist anything on my network?
I mean, that's a broad sweeping policy. There have to be exceptions to every rule to a certain degree for functionality and for compliance purposes. Kind of to revert to that question that we had from the first audience member about putting in special clauses for that. This is, it really depends on the vendor. It depends on how the contract is structured and how often they've done this, how many larger clients they've gone with. They should be open to it to a certain degree. I mean, if somebody's afraid to participate in that, I think usually we have to get on a call and talk with these folks who are a little hesitant to do so. And once we assure them what we're doing, kind of everything I've just broken down in the last question with the Python-based tools and the GitHub-based tools, well, Python initiation packages, kind of with those kind of things, whenever we tell them exactly what we're going to be doing, I mean, we can break down all the tools that we're doing when we're talking in a scoping call. And that is usually what will relieve that issue. A little bit more communication is always how that exception is made.
Right, so we got, as an internal auditor, I'm heavily reliant on my IT team to give us server lists and names, IP addresses to test, etc. How do you better ensure that they are fully disclosing everything that needs testing?
Let me see this one again. This
yeah,
is a
you
good
can
question.
want to read that.
As an internal auditor, I'm heavily reliant on my IT team to give us server lists, names, IP addresses to test, etc. How do you better ensure that they are fully disclosing everything that needs testing? If this is your first time, so this is a very good question, and it's really It's really dependent on how often you've done regular penetration testing. A big thing that we notice here, and really the whole focus of the webinar about how there's no wrong time to start a penetration test, is really for multiple organizations. It depends on how many active hosts you have. If you're a very large organization and it's going to take, at least a day and a half, maybe 2 days to, even with a proper ping sweep. I mean, if you include the VoIP phone system in there, usually there's just a Cisco application point available on that, and something with session initiation protocol with SIP. That's usually all you have in there. If it's referencing to some database, or if your VoIP phone system, if you've done some kind of migration from a phone book exchange, it depends on the kind of data that you pull over. So it's dependent on if you want to test those type of VoIP phones. It depends on that specific TCP/IP functionality for your solution that you have in place on your network. So if you don't know what's best to check, I mean, you always want to check, you always want to put the oldest items onto these types of tests, unless you've accepted the risk on certain pieces of hardware or operating systems that you have in use on certain hardware. Items that are past the end of life, do not have extended support. You don't have to have us test those, because you know that they're bad already if you formally declared them as, a risk to the organization. If they are an internally accepted risk for now, I mean, they should be isolated off anyway, because those type of systems that aren't receiving patches anymore are the hot button for exploitable activity. That's what everything is. If any of you have followed some of like the DEF CON or Black Hat disclosures this year, everything's going to be about enterprise based authentication. So it's going to be very, very interesting as we see more of this research come out, and it's going to be more and more important that your patch management procedures are in place, but you can't just jump the gun on everything, especially a major system patch. So work with your managed service providers to have a testing environment in place, check with these items, and also get any feedback if they see similar environments as yours. That is what I would say is the biggest thing.
All right, got one more for you guys. How do you disable DH ciphers entirely?
That is a fantastic question. We're not going to have, do you have more on this, Gavin?
I don't know exactly how to do it myself, but I did speak to a client who we did a retest after the fact, and I was able to confirm that I did an SSL scan on the host and that it was not there. I believe that they went into their settings somehow and just entirely disabled it.
Probably just remove that public certificate for that DH key inside their network. So kind of to build off of what Gavin said there, this is something new, and there's not really, as far as just removing old Diffie-Hellman keys, yeah, you want to remove anything that's not. So let me line this out. So when it comes to dheater today, I actually talked to one of our clients. Oh yeah, I'll get to that one. I talked to one of our clients who has this right now. One of the ones that I was using for, it's the client that was actually mapping out all of the SSH drops that I was talking about in there. I talked to him on the way to the webinar today. The thing that we were both, the practice that we were both in a consensus on is that it's better to focus the mitigation to an elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman exchange key to your external based, to your externally hosted applications, because those are the ones that are going to be vulnerable to that DOS attack from the public internet. So anything that's any kind of external facing web server for online banking, things like that, anything that would cause serious, inability for your members or consumers to exchange currency, I would focus on those solutions getting those elliptical curve DHE ciphers first. Now, as far as the internal network goes, if you leave some of your older DH keys on the internal network there, the DOS risk is bigger for your externally facing captive portals. Those are the ones where you can just get a ton of different sessions from the outside world that can take that down, right? But on the internal network, you can stay on DH a little bit longer because you're going to be able to identify the activity that's creating all of those sessions that are going to create that DOS attack. It's much easier to sequester and mitigate that kind of attack. It's much harder to do from the public internet. So that's why right now I would say the best hypothesis for this, this isn't a confirmed method because everybody has different issues, right? Different platforms that we use. It's kind of the same thing that we audit. We look at different vendors for this. So the best thing that you can do is enable this on anything that's externally facing. That'll mitigate any external type of DOS attack to a captive portal that you need for other functionality for members or consumers. That's what I would say. All right. And of course, you can email us with any questions on this because we're getting a lot of new data for this. It's very important that if you've ever had an audit where we talk about information sharing and any of those types of verified channels for that communication with other industry peers, this is a great example of what that's for. You want to find people who have similar configurations to you, and then that way you can coalesce on what's the best method that worked for you, talk about different system functionality, and they're an industry peer, so it's only going to help everybody. You know, with all the external conflicts we have outside of the US today, it's best to share and everybody get their network a little bit more secure together, because you never know what could happen. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Right, and will the service provider utilize manual hack methods to discover vulnerabilities or rely on automated scanning techniques?
Depends on their level of sophistication and how many people are performing this attack. If it's an individual, more automated scanning. If you have a team of people, they're going to be a lot quieter and they're going to have more time. If they're not doing it for personal gain and more for you know, national advancement like an APT would, they're going to take their time. Time is on their side. Resources are on their side. They don't have to punch a clock. They just rotate out the workers, right?
Okay. Should we uninstall Internet Explorer due to end of life?
That would be a personal question for you to decide with your internal, with your chief technology officer and your chief information officer.
Okay.
It depends on the functionality that you have and how great of a risk it is to you. And honestly, this is a great question to ask post-penetration test. It's really hard to answer that for you pre-penetration test. But ideally, yes, you'd want to find a more secure solution, but it depends on your functionality that you have in place.
Great. And will the provider notify you immediately if of high-risk vulnerabilities are found during the test rather than waiting to inform you until the final report?
Absolutely. I mean, we will call we will call every time that if we find something that's actively exploitable, yes, you'll be getting a phone call immediately. You should be. That's what we train on. 100%.